Yeah.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining me today. Last week I had shared a video and podcast focused on teacher questioning, and really I'd like to do a few of these videos, maybe not all in order, but videos that are focused on instruction and instructional strategies. Because as I shared in the last video, there's been a lot of focus on technology, integration, and innovation, and I'd love to continue conversations that also focus on instruction and instructional strategies specifically that maybe we can leverage technology to enhance, but certainly we don't want to forget about. And when we do integrate technology, we want to make sure we understand these strategies well and know what makes them effective in the first place. So last time I talked to you about teacher questioning, today I'm going to talk to you about formative assessment. Now this is an instructional strategy on which our school has spent quite a bit of time. And it's really important that we develop first a clear understanding of what formative assessment is and what it is not. First and foremost, I'll say, to make it clear, formative assessment is a process. It's actually not a thing we do. I think the number one common misconception related to formative assessment is that all it is a check for understanding. So I will often hear educators say, I did formative assessment in my class. We did a Kahoot and reviewed key concepts from the unit. Or I used an exit ticket in my class and that's how I did formative assessment. Those are just two examples of many ways in which you can check for student understanding, but that alone is not formative assessment. That is one step in formative assessment, which there are either, depending on who you would ask, certainly, I would say there's about 4 steps, but I'm actually going to share 5. One that's not an official step of formative assessment, but one thing that has to happen along the process. So we'll say it's a 5-step process. So the first step that's really important when it comes to designing or planning to do the formative assessment process or implement it is that we must first have clear objectives. These objectives are usually derived from our standards and anchors from our course curriculum, but they are written in student-friendly language. Oftentimes, you may also refer to them as learning targets. Sometimes they're used interchangeably. It's really dependent upon how you define it and your school defines it. People will argue objectives and learning targets are different. Well, you can make those arguments, but reality is, what is your common understanding in your school, and use that term. So for this example, I'm going to call them student-friendly learning targets. And one of the things we did a few years ago in our school is we broke down our standards and anchors for our courses, and we developed student-friendly learning targets for every class, every unit. And that's important because if we're going to have a clear target that students are aiming at, they should understand clearly what that target is, what that objective is. So we wrote them in student-friendly language. We used I can statements, as you may have heard of. So I can add 2-digit numbers as a very simple elementary example. But we use these for all of our courses in 6th through 8th grade, and our teachers did an awesome job developing these for their courses. It took a while, it took a lot of collaboration, but it was worth it because now we have something to base not just our lesson and unit planning on, but our assessments. If we're thinking backwards design and we think, what are our objectives? Let's design the assessment and backwards design the lesson and unit plan. We have something to clearly aim at. And we also have something we can communicate that students can understand. You may appreciate the fact that I remember years ago we had to have our standards written on the board. And standards really aren't beneficial to anybody except people doing curriculum work, in my opinion. I have found standards are often confusing for teachers and even principals such as myself. I'm much more likely to be able to understand, access, and work with student-friendly learning objectives. In my opinion, we can write our standards as those type of objectives. We don't need standards that nobody can understand. They should be broken down into clear language. But understanding that our curriculums are based on our state standards and broken down from there, we develop student-friendly learning targets. And it's important that we communicate these learning targets up front to students and communicate them in many ways. They should be written, they should be visually posted, and we should verbally state them. And we should refer back to them during the course of instruction, which is the second step. So if the first step is identifying clear learning objectives and communicating them clearly to our students, the next step will be the instruction slash project slash learning task, whatever you want to call it. And again, this is where I added a step into the process, because that has to happen before you do the checking for understanding and the next steps. So I'm just going to say we're going to do whatever the learning task involves, whether that's a project, whether that's group work, whatever you design in terms of instruction. We're not going to get into task because that's sort of a separate instructional strategy, but we'll say number 1 is setting clear objectives, number 2 is the learning task, and then number 3 is checking for understanding. And number 3 in terms of the process of formative assessment. And when we check for understanding, we can do this in a number of ways. We can do it visually, we can do it through questioning, we can do it through discussion, we could observe student work, we could send out a quick formative quiz or questionnaire survey to get feedback from students. We can use an exit ticket. All those things are options. You can do a million different things. We had shared a menu of ways to check for understanding with our teachers, and they even added some and created more. And some of them included doing student drawings, so many different creative ways to check for understanding. But it doesn't have to be formalized like a quiz. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. It can be simple. But the goal of checking for understanding is that we get a clear picture of individual levels of progress and mastery. So if I'm checking for understanding and I use questioning to refer back to that strategy, and I call on one student to check for an answer, I am not gathering the type of information I need from that way of checking for understanding. I'm only getting feedback from one student. I really don't know what anybody else knows. So that's why developing ways in which we could assess all students' levels of mastery and progress is really important to think about when we're checking for understanding. How are we doing it? And am I getting the information I need from all of my students? Now comes step 4, which is feedback. Feedback is a very important strategy instructionally, and it is part of the formative assessment process. For feedback to be effective, it should be timely, specific, understandable by the student, and then actionable. So it needs to be given to the student in a timely manner. It needs to be specific. Again, we're not focusing on, hey, good job, keep going. We want to talk to them about what they're doing well. You wrote a really good introduction sentence, or you were really able to state your claim really well, but you didn't support it with evidence. Let's talk about ways in which we can do a better job there. And then you could use coaching language and questioning and scaffolding to guide the students to a higher level of understanding. Those are all types of feedback. Again, when we give feedback, we want to think about, is it specific to a student so it is actionable? If we want our feedback to be actionable, students need to know specifically to them what they're doing well and what they can improve upon. And then have some idea on strategies on how they can improve upon that. You know, nothing's worse than telling a student, you really need to improve your introduction. Here you go, and giving them back their essay. Well, if they didn't know how to do it well the first time, without any other guidance, they're not going to be able to go then take it and improve upon that introduction. So when we give feedback, it's important that we do the last step of this process, which is follow-up. So again, we're checking for understanding. We have the learning task, clear objectives, learning task, checking for understanding, feedback, and then follow-up, number 5. And follow-up could look many different ways. It can be sitting down with a small group of students who've really struggled on their introduction paragraph and talking to them, maybe doing some modeling, doing some mini lessons. Sending other students maybe that need to go access certain resources so they know where to find them to improve upon. Maybe it's their references page and they need to know how to cite their references better. Maybe you introduce them to Purdue OWL or another site that could guide them in that. But again, that follow-up should be specific to the student and align with the feedback that you've given them to go improve their learning. So again, for formative assessment to be effective, it's important to think about those steps in the process during our unit and lesson planning and designing responses or details within each one of those steps to make sure we're doing as an effective job as possible with our students, because we don't want to waste our time or our students' time just doing these checks for understanding or exit tickets just so we can say, yes, we did formative assessment. First, we need to know what it is, and we need to be doing it well. So again, to recap, clear objectives right up front, communicate them clearly, Identify the learning tasks that you're going to use for students. Identify the ways in which you're going to check for understanding. How you're going to give that feedback, whether it's verbally, whether it's written, whether it's individualized or based on small group, but again, it should be actionable and timely. And then finally, what does the follow-up look like? What are you doing and what are students doing to improve their learning? I hope you found this video valuable. I really appreciate those of you that have tuned in today and have followed along in my videos. I hope you find value in them. Again, you could certainly follow me, my blogs, and my videos on principalmkelly.com. You can find information and also check me out on my YouTube channel and find these there, or on my iTunes podcast. Just search for Michael Kelly. Thanks again. Have an awesome day.
Yeah.